Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
There are moments that split your life clean down the middle, before and after, and they rarely come with warning. For me, it happened on a Sunday afternoon in late spring, the kind of day where the sky pretends nothing bad could ever happen under its perfect, cloudless glow. I had spent the entire morning preparing my house for what was supposed to be a casual family brunch, though nothing with my family is ever truly casual. My parents had begged me to host for once, citing the charm of my newly renovated place and the fact that it had just the right amount of space and light. What they really meant was that they didn't want to deal with Aunt Carol and her adult man-child of a son, Tyler, who had become something of a traveling chaos machine since graduating from college 7 years ago, and doing absolutely nothing of substance since. I had said yes because, well, that's what you do in families like mine. You give in to the softer pressures. You play the role of the capable daughter, the one with the polished home, the working oven, and the patience to handle everyone else's dysfunction. By noon, the house smelled like rosemary and roasted potatoes, and my French press coffee was flowing like wine, which, ironically, would become a much bigger deal in about 30 minutes. Now, let me paint a picture of my living room, because it matters more than you think. The focal point of the space was a pale gray, custom-upholstered Italian designer couch, $12,000 of clean lines, imported linen, and minimalist elegance. My pride and joy. My reward to myself for landing the $1 million spa contract last fall. I didn't have kids. I wasn't married. That couch was, in many ways, the most expensive commitment I had ever made, and I loved it fiercely. I didn't let dogs on it. I kept it covered when guests brought their children. And I sure as hell didn't let red wine near it. So imagine my reaction when Tyler, slouched, shirt half untucked, reeking faintly of weed and smugness, stumbled backward during some overacted story about a party in the Hamptons and splashed an entire glass of Cabernet all across the left cushion. Not a splash. Not a drop. A fucking cascade. The room went dead silent, as if someone had turned the volume off mid-scene. Tyler looked down, blinked, then chuckled like he'd dropped a breadstick. Oh damn. That's wild. My bad. My jaw clenched so hard I could feel it in my temple. I didn't speak. I just walked over, grabbed a towel from the kitchen, and started dabbing furiously, already knowing it was too late. Linen absorbs. And red wine? It settles in like an old regret. Tyler sauntered over, completely unfazed. Come on, it's not like you can't afford another one. Or better yet, your folks will just replace it, right? I mean, they're good for it. He actually laughed when he said that. A light, dismissive chuckle like the whole thing was just a footnote in his day. I looked up at my parents, expecting some kind of reaction, some defense on my behalf, but they just gave that apologetic half-smile that older parents use when they don't want to escalate. My father muttered, "It's just a couch, sweetheart," and my mother added, "Will help if it can't be cleaned." Right there. That's when something inside me shifted. It wasn't about the couch anymore. Not really. It was about every single time Tyler had broken something, disrespected someone, or derailed a perfectly normal gathering with his unchecked idiocy, and been given a free pass because he didn't mean it, or he's just going through a phase. A phase? He was 28, lived rent-free in his mom's condo, called himself an aspiring brand partner, and had fewer responsibilities than my houseplants. And somehow, he was still protected by them, by Aunt Carol, by this unspoken family agreement that boys will be boys, and girls like me should just let it go. That moment, kneeling on my floor, soaking up $12,000 worth of damage while the person responsible joked about it, that was my line. The line I didn't know I had until someone like Tyler danced over it in soaked socks and laughed about the mess he made. But here's the thing, memory's funny. It doesn't just remind you of what happened. Sometimes, it hands you a gift. As I stared down at the ruined fabric, I remembered something strange, something specific, something I hadn't thought about in years, an incident, way back, when Tyler knocked over an antique sculpture at Thanksgiving, and my lawyer friend Danielle, over too much Chardonnay, joked that I should start having my guests sign a liability clause. And, being the overly cautious type that I am, I actually did. I stood up slowly, towel still in hand, and walked to the office down the hall. I opened the bottom drawer of the file cabinet, the one labeled Miscellaneous Guest Docs, and there it was, an old manila folder with a few pages inside, including one that had Tyler's name, the date, and his lazy, half-assed signature. At the time, it had seemed silly, just a precaution. Now, it felt like a loaded weapon. This is where I want to ask you something. Have you ever had that moment where someone did something awful and everyone just expected you to smile, nod, and swallow it down for the sake of keeping the peace? What did you do? Did you let it go? Or did you, like me, feel something shift that you couldn't ignore? Back in the living room, Tyler was still chuckling to himself, scrolling through his phone like he'd just dropped gum on the sidewalk instead of ruining someone else's expensive property. My parents were trying to move on, talking about the omelets, pretending nothing serious had happened. But I didn't go back to the kitchen. I just stood there, looking at the paper in my hand, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the peacekeeper. I felt like something else entirely, like maybe I was finally done playing nice. Tyler thought this was over. But I had a signature, a clause, and a hell of a long memory. And as far as I was concerned, things were just getting started. I didn't sleep that night, not because of the wine stain or the ruined couch, not even because of Tyler's infuriating smugness or the passive cowardice radiating from my parents' increasingly disappointing faces, but because I had opened a door in my memory that refused to close. That paper, that single piece of paper with his signature on it, sat on my nightstand like a burning coal, radiating heat, pulsing with potential. I kept looking at it, rereading the text that Danielle had written for me years ago in what we both thought was an overly cautious, slightly neurotic attempt at protecting a few valuable items from careless guests. The clause was simple, straightforward, legal, and signed. Any damages to specified property would be the financial responsibility of the guest, with the signature confirming acknowledgement and liability. It was the kind of thing you never think you'll need until the exact moment you realize it's your lifeline. Lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling fan slicing through the still air of my bedroom, I began to replay every moment from the brunch, dissecting each expression, each response, and, most of all, each silence. My parents' reaction was gnawing at me in a way that felt far more personal than the actual act of the spill. My mother's tone, soft and conciliatory, her hand resting lightly on my father's knee like she was trying to keep him calm, as if I were the aggressor for being upset. My father, who had once yelled at a neighbor's kid for scraping my childhood swing set with a screwdriver, had simply muttered, "Let's not make this a thing," with all the enthusiasm of someone changing the TV channel. The speed with which they had pivoted from support to dismissal wasn't just hurtful, it was revealing. It told me exactly where I stood in this family's unspoken hierarchy of who mattered and who didn't. And apparently, Tyler's ego came before my dignity. What really twisted the knife, though, was how familiar it felt. Because this wasn't new, it was just the latest version of an old story I'd been quietly living through since I was old enough to notice that some people in this family were allowed to make messes while others were expected to clean them up without complaint. Tyler, with his litany of screw-ups, tantrums, and minor disasters, had always landed on his feet, usually cushioned by some version of "he didn't mean it" or "it's not worth the drama." But when I had made mistakes, small ones, like dropping a glass at Thanksgiving when I was 12, or bigger ones, like choosing interior design over law school, I had never been extended that same grace. My missteps were lessons, reminders, quiet reprimands. His were jokes. The next morning, I called Danielle. She picked up on the second ring, already halfway through a croissant by the sound of it, and before I could even get into the full story, she said, "Tyler again? What the hell did he do this time? Back his car into your pool?" I told her about the spill, the laughter, the way he practically dared me to get upset, and most importantly, the clause. The moment I mentioned it, her tone shifted from amused to razor-sharp. "Wait, he signed it? You still have it?" I told her I did, that I had checked the date, verified the itemized property list, and everything was clear. She went quiet for a moment, which only made my heart beat faster. Then she said the words I had been hoping, almost aching, to hear, You could absolutely take this to small claims and win. Like, without question. It wasn't just about money, not anymore. It was about the principle, the fact that he had laughed in my face, confident in the protection of this family's unspoken rules that had always shielded him from consequence. It was about standing in that living room with a towel in my hand while my parents tried to rush past it, tried to pretend nothing important had happened, just to preserve the illusion of family harmony. It was about how little they thought I'd actually do anything. I could already hear my mother's voice, calm but tight, saying, "Don't overreact," and my father's voice layered on top of it, saying, "We'll handle it, Emily." And I could also hear Aunt Carol, sharp and bitter, saying things like, "You're really going to punish family over a couch?" But under all of that, cutting through like a blade, was my own voice, clearer now than it had ever been, saying, "He doesn't get to keep doing this. Not anymore." I printed out a second copy of the document, slid it into a fresh folder, and started researching small claims process in my county. I wasn't entirely sure I was going to file yet. I wasn't looking for a fight, but I was ready for one. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time when it came to my family, not anger, not frustration, but power. The kind of power that comes not from being loud or dramatic, but from knowing you are absolutely, legally, and morally in the right. And knowing that no one expects you to use it. There's a strange peace in that. I didn't text Tyler. I didn't mention the clause. I simply let the silence grow heavy, thick, uncomfortable. I let them all sit in it while I got my documents in order. Tyler would keep thinking he got away with it. My parents would assume I was calming down. But I wasn't calming down, I was waiting. Waiting for the exact moment when it would be too late for any of them to talk me out of what I already knew I was going to do. And I knew exactly when that moment would be. Sunday. 7 days from the spill. Long enough for the dry cleaner to confirm that the couch couldn't be salvaged. Long enough for Tyler to feel safe again. And just long enough for the certified envelope to arrive at his door, containing a polite but unmistakably formal notice of intent to pursue damages in court. Let him laugh now. Because the next time he opens his mouth, it won't be to mock me. It'll be to explain himself to a judge. The letter was sent certified on Monday morning, delivered with that same cold precision I'd come to associate with bureaucracy, with its stiff envelopes and traceable barcodes and the sweet, dry perfume of official language. I stood at the postal counter watching the clerk scan it into the system, my pulse as steady as if I were mailing a birthday card, and yet somewhere deep in my chest, there was a satisfying tension building. Like a coiled spring finally about to be let loose after years of being compressed under the weight of expectations, pleasantries, and the oppressive culture of "don't make waves" that my family had clung to like religion. I wasn't sending this letter because I wanted a spectacle, and I wasn't doing it for revenge, though I knew damn well that's how they'd spin it. I was doing it because someone had to draw a line. Someone had to say, enough, and that person, it turned out, was me. 3 days later, Tyler received the envelope, and not even 20 minutes passed before my phone lit up with his name, followed by a predictably unpunctuated text that read, "WTF is this? You can't be serious." I didn't answer. I let him sit with it, let him feel the cold echo of no reply, because nothing rattles a man like Tyler more than not being immediately acknowledged. He called next, 4 times in a row, and then, apparently unsatisfied with digital confrontation, decided to show up in person the following day, wearing his signature distressed hoodie, sunglasses, and an expression that tried very hard to read confident, but barely masked the growing panic just under the surface. He didn't even wait for me to invite him in. He just barged through the doorway the second I opened it, waving the letter like it was an eviction notice and pacing my hardwood floors like a frat boy on the verge of failing out of school. "Are you seriously suing me over a couch?" he asked, loud and slow, as if the absurdity of the sentence alone should be enough to make me drop everything and apologize for the inconvenience. I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, posture calm, letting him fill the room with noise while I stayed quiet, because I've learned that silence, when wielded correctly, can be louder than screaming. "I mean, Jesus, Emily," he went on, gesturing with both hands like he was presenting evidence to a jury of Instagram followers. "We're family. I said I was sorry. You can't be this uptight forever. When I finally spoke, I didn't raise my voice or even change my tone. I just said, "You signed a document that makes you liable." I'm not being uptight. I'm enforcing an agreement. And the second those words left my mouth, his whole posture changed, as if suddenly realizing that I wasn't bluffing, that this wasn't some theatrical tantrum that would fizzle out after a few guilt-laden phone calls from my mother. He stopped pacing. He stared at me, eyebrows furrowed like he was trying to solve a complex riddle with very few brain cells available. "You're not serious," he muttered, but it came out softer this time, with less bravado and more disbelief. Like he couldn't quite wrap his mind around the idea that the girl he used to tease for alphabetizing her DVD collection was now standing in front of him, holding him accountable in a way that no one in our family ever had. "You're blowing this way out of proportion," he added, and I could almost laugh at how predictable the script had become. Step 1, minimize the damage. Step 2, center your own feelings. Step 3, guilt-trip the woman until she drops it. But this time, the script had changed. By the time my parents got wind of what was happening, likely tipped off by Aunt Carol, who had probably heard a very exaggerated, Tyler-centric version of the story, the calls started coming in rapid succession. My mother first, her voice calm but clipped, as though she was practicing some internal mantra to keep it light. She started with questions disguised as concern. "Is this really necessary, honey?" Followed by, "He's just embarrassed," and then the inevitable, "We were going to help you replace it anyway." And that's when I understood the depth of the rot, that even now, even in the face of clear documentation and legal precedent, they still thought this could be smoothed over. Handled within the family like it was some kind of corporate PR mess, instead of what it actually was, accountability. I told her plainly, without anger but without any room for confusion, that I wasn't looking for their money and I wasn't interested in a group therapy session about Tyler's hurt feelings. I wanted him to own what he'd done. Her voice dropped to that wounded tone mothers use when they feel cornered. "Emily, please. You're better than this." And maybe I was, but that wasn't the point. I wasn't trying to be better anymore, I was trying to be fair. The following day, my father showed up at my door, which was both unexpected and deeply ironic considering how rarely he left the house for anything that didn't involve golf or a doctor's appointment. He sat down, took one look at the stained couch, now covered with a neutral beige throw blanket, and said, "It's a nice piece, no doubt. But is it worth tearing the family apart?" That sentence stayed with me long after he left, not because of what it said, but because of what it revealed. In their eyes, I wasn't protecting property, I was threatening peace. I was the disruptor. Not the man who spilled the wine. Not the one who laughed about it. Not the one who mocked me in my own home. Me. And yet, behind all the pleading and pressure, none of them ever asked the one question that mattered most. Why did I feel the need to go this far? Because the answer was simple, really. For once in my life, I wanted the person who caused the damage to be the one to clean it up. Not a parent. Not a family mediator. Not me. Him. As Tyler stormed out of my house later that evening, muttering something about how he'd talk to a lawyer and see what his rights were, I closed the door behind him and felt, for the first time in years, like I had finally said the thing I had been biting back for most of my adult life. No more free passes. No more cleanups. No more pretending that protecting someone else's comfort was worth sacrificing my self-respect. Let them call it revenge if they want. I called it a receipt. One with his name on it, signed in his own careless handwriting. By the time Sunday rolled around, exactly 1 week since the brunch-turned battlefield, the dust that should have settled by then had only thickened into a storm of cold shoulders, back-channel conversations, and brittle attempts at damage control wrapped in the usual family language of guilt, tradition, and selective memory. I knew, without needing to be told, that the family group chat had turned into a series of private side threads, my mother texting my aunt ranting to my cousin Olivia, my father probably sitting in his recliner with a scotch and muttering about how this never would have happened if Emily just laughed it off like normal people do. What they didn't realize, or maybe couldn't quite accept, was that this wasn't about the couch anymore. It hadn't been since the moment Tyler looked me in the eye, shrugged, and said, "Whatever." There's something uniquely offensive about that single word when it comes from someone who's spent their entire life floating above consequences, especially when that person believes the world, or more precisely their family, will always shield them from the impact of their own negligence. That, whatever, was the crack in the dam that had been holding back years of frustration, not just about Tyler, but about the way my family had come to operate, always smoothing things over, always downplaying the fallout, always prioritizing appearances over accountability. It was like living in a house where the walls were full of mold, but everyone kept lighting candles and complimenting the paint. The day before our court date, a simple, quiet appearance in small claims court that would likely take no more than 20 minutes if left uncontested, Tyler showed up again, but this time, he wasn't alone. Standing next to him on my porch, arms crossed and brows furrowed with performative indignation, was a woman I recognized vaguely from his Instagram stories, Madison, his so-called brand manager, though from what I could tell, her only job consisted of editing his workout videos and tagging overpriced products in his selfies. She looked me up and down the way a customer might inspect a returned item, like she was trying to figure out whether I was salvageable or a complete loss. Tyler didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk," he said, his voice already adopting that tone people use when they think they're being reasonable while barely concealing their disdain. Madison chimed in immediately, explaining that Tyler was willing to make amends, but that my approach was damaging to his brand and might cause him to lose a pending sponsorship with a major wellness beverage company, which she said with the solemnity of a person delivering news about a life-threatening illness. I stood there, silent, letting her finish her little monologue, because part of me was genuinely curious to see how far down this ridiculous rabbit hole they were willing to crawl. When they were done, I said nothing. Instead, I walked into the living room, returned with a manila folder, and dropped it on the kitchen table without ceremony. Inside was a printed screenshot from Tyler's Instagram, posted mere minutes before the brunch began, a photo of him holding a glass of wine, raised high in the air like some kind of offering, standing directly in front of my $12,000 couch, with the caption, "Sundays with the fam, cheers." The timestamp was clear. The glass was full. The couch was pristine. It was visual confirmation that the damage was entirely his doing, with zero ambiguity. I slid it across the table. "You posted the evidence yourself," I said. "Thanks for saving me the trouble." That was the moment his performative calm shattered. The smugness fell away from his face like a mask too heavy to keep holding, and I watched, with a detached sort of fascination, as realization set in. Not just that he was cornered, but that he had walked into the trap entirely on his own. Madison, for her part, stiffened and started muttering something about public relations fallout, but Tyler was now staring at the photo like it had personally betrayed him. "You're serious," he said, finally, as if the reality of my intentions had only just now landed. "You're really gonna humiliate me over a couch?" "No," I replied, calmly, deliberately. "I'm going to make you take responsibility in front of the same audience you try to impress every damn day with lies and filters and borrowed clout." "I'm not humiliating you, Tyler. You did that to yourself." Madison, realizing the wind was shifting and probably calculating the probability of salvaging whatever brand deals Tyler thought he was about to land, leaned in and asked, "What do you want, exactly?" It was a transactional question, clinical and cold, like she was negotiating a contract instead of trying to salvage a relationship. I looked her in the eye and, after a long pause, said something that surprised even me in how simple and final it sounded: a public apology. On his platform. In his words. No spin. No disclaimers. He admits what he did. He takes the blame. And he wires the full amount by Monday. Or we go to court. Tyler opened his mouth to protest, but Madison stopped him with a hand on his arm, her nails perfectly manicured, her eyes calculating. "You don't have a choice," she said flatly. "You'll lose. And it'll look worse than this." The silence that followed was thick, but not tense. It was the silence of a person realizing that their usual escape routes had collapsed. No parents to step in. No family members rushing to patch things up. Just him, A signed liability clause, a stained couch, and a woman who finally decided she was done making peace at her own expense. As they left, Tyler said nothing, which, given his usual verbosity, was louder than anything he could have shouted. Madison gave me one last look, half curiosity, half respect, and then they were gone. That night, I poured myself a glass of white wine, sat in the exact spot where the red had spilled, and stared at the screen of my laptop, waiting to see if he'd follow through. I didn't know for sure if he would, but something told me that, for once, the fear of public shame might just outweigh his reflexive entitlement. And if it didn't, well, I had already bookmarked the courthouse address. Everyone has a price. Tyler's, apparently, was public accountability. And I was finally collecting. There was something oddly anticlimactic about the way it all went down, not because it lacked drama. If anything, it carried the peculiar energy of a reality TV confession, but because, after weeks of tension building like a thunderstorm behind my temples, after sleepless nights playing out every possible outcome in my mind, after being painted as the villain in my own family's melodrama for doing something as radical as enforcing a written agreement, the final act unfolded not in court, not in front of a judge, not in the emotionally sterile hall of justice I had envisioned, but in the digital theater of Tyler's carefully curated online world, where aesthetic mattered more than honesty. And every angle was chosen to present the illusion of control. The video went live just after 10 on a Tuesday morning, a time likely chosen by his manager to catch both the East Coast professionals on their coffee breaks and the West Coast crowd just starting their day. I got the notification not from Tyler directly, of course. He hadn't spoken to me since leaving my house with his proverbial tail between his legs, but from a friend who screenshotted it with the message, "You really did it." And yes, I had. But what mattered more was that he had done it too. I clicked the link and watched, not with triumph exactly, but with something closer to clinical curiosity, the way a scientist might observe a particularly stubborn subject finally responding to stimuli. There he was, sitting on a neutral beige sofa in what looked like a rented studio space, backlit with warm LEDs and flanked by a potted plant and a branded water bottle, trying his best to look humbled and authentic, though the slight squint in his eyes betrayed the bright ring light glaring just off-screen. He started with a deep sigh, the kind of exaggerated exhale meant to signal emotional gravity, and then launched into a statement that had clearly been rehearsed, if not entirely scripted. "Hey, guys," he began, "I want to take a moment to talk about something that happened recently that I haven't handled the best way, and I owe someone in my life, and, honestly, all of you, an apology." What followed was a nearly 3-minute monologue in which he, with carefully spaced pauses and strategically lowered tones, recounted the wine spill incident, admitted that he had behaved immaturely, acknowledged that the damage was real and expensive, and confessed that he had initially refused to take responsibility out of pride. He didn't name me directly, perhaps because he couldn't bring himself to say my name into a camera watched by thousands, or perhaps because his manager still thought there was a way to keep some of his dignity intact. But anyone watching could read between the lines. He admitted fault. He admitted liability. And most importantly, he admitted it publicly. He ended with a statement that tried to loop in his audience, turning the whole event into a teachable moment about owning your actions and being better even when it's uncomfortable. And while I could have rolled my eyes at the performative tone of it all, I didn't. Because in the end, the words were there. The accountability was there. And somewhere, in the tangle of ego and marketing strategy, there was also the unmistakable sting of consequence. The wire transfer came in later that afternoon. $12,000, confirmed, processed, and final. No notes. No messages. Just cold numbers landing in my account like punctuation on the end of a very long, very overdue sentence. It should have felt like victory. It should have tasted sweet. And for a moment, it did. But the silence that followed wasn't celebratory. It was heavy, dense. The kind of silence that settles not because the noise has stopped, but because people have turned away altogether. My aunt stopped calling. My parents, while still technically in touch, spoke to me through stilted conversations that circled around everything and addressed nothing. My mother sent an article about stress management. My father forwarded a joke email chain he probably hadn't even read. There were no apologies, no acknowledgements, just avoidance dressed up as normalcy. One afternoon, a week after the video aired, I stopped by my parents' house. My mother offered me tea. My father asked about work. The couch was never mentioned. Tyler's name never came up. And I realized in that moment that I hadn't broken the family, I had simply exposed the cracks that had always been there. What I had done was remove the shared illusion that keeping the peace was more important than telling the truth. I had shown them what it looked like when someone in the family said no, not this time. And they didn't know what to do with that. They had no script for it. So they pretended it never happened. Later that night, while cleaning out a drawer, I found an old photo, Thanksgiving, probably 10 years ago. Tyler was laughing with his mouth wide open, holding a plate full of food he hadn't helped prepare. I was in the background, clearing dishes. No one was looking at me. And I stared at that photo for a long time, not out of nostalgia, but because it confirmed something I had always felt but never dared say aloud. I had never really been seen. Not fully. Not as a person with boundaries, with dignity, with the right to draw a line and say, "This is mine, and you don't get to ruin it." I still have the couch. The stain never fully came out, but I kept it as a kind of relic, not of what was destroyed, but of what was revealed. Every time I look at it, I remember not the moment the wine spilled, but the moment I decided I was done being the one who cleaned up other people's messes. And that's a kind of justice that no money can buy. Still, sometimes late at night, I find myself wondering, did I go too far? Was it too much to ask for something as simple as responsibility? Or had I just finally done what no one else in my family ever had the courage to do? I don't have the answer. And maybe that's the point. Because justice isn't always about clarity. Sometimes, it's just about choosing not to swallow what's bitter, even if everyone else insists it's sweet.